It's time for another viewer request video, and this time we're going to take a look at TypeScript React testing. So many of you wanted this one, and I am happy to provide. So on this blue collar coder, we're going to take a look at the React testing library, and not just that, we're going to actually also test hooks and test connections to Redux and Zustand. See, I got that right. It's really going to be fun stuff. But in the meantime, of course, I want to tell you about my new book, No BS TS, the book. It's just out recently and it covers every single No BS TS episode. It's really exciting stuff. And it's going to cover this video right here since I think it's an important TypeScript topic. But okay, I've prattled on enough. Let's go check out how to do React testing. Okay, so I've set up a Create React app using the TypeScript template, and I brought in Redux and a couple other things so that we just don't have to deal with the yarn stuff, but I'll show you those as we go along. It's the standard out-of-the-box app that we've seen before. Let's go take a look at app.tsx. It's got the spinny logo and all that. But if you notice, there's actually the app test tsx. So this is in the same directory as the app.tsx file, and it runs a test. And it uses the React testing library. It's actually pretty simple stuff. You render the component that you want, and then you go and kind of poke at it a little bit, and you create some expectations around that. So in this case, it's going to look at the app component, and it's going to find the learn React text and the element for that, which is going to be a link, and it just expects it to be there. It's not a particularly sophisticated test. So the first test that we're going to do is I'm going to go and create a person component that's going to render a div with a person's name in it. And then we'll go and use this kind of testing to make sure that that component works. So let's go and create a new file called person.tsx. And we'll import React. And then we'll export a const person component. It's going to take a name. And it's going to output a div with name is, and then the name. And of course, we need to put some types on that. So one way to do that is simply just put it right here. Name is going to be a string. Okay, so let's go and make a test for this. I'm just going to go and copy and paste this because I'm lazy. And I'll create a new file called person.test.tsx. And then I'll bring in person from that person file. And we're going to see if it renders a name. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Jest, which is the underlying unit test framework here, you basically define a test by using the test function. It takes a name, and then it takes a function that's going to run that test. So in this case, we want to render the person. We want to give it a name. And then we want to go see if it's rendered properly. So now we could just go and see if it has name as Jack in there. Let's actually give that a try. Make sure. So we'll do yarn test. And that's actually going to run a test watcher, which is actually kind of cool. So we'll hit all to see all the tests running. And it looks like we passed both. That's really good. So now looking at by text is just one way of finding an element. You can also get by role. So this would be the ARIA role, and let's just say that we want content info is the role that we're looking for. So now we need to make a change over here to say that our div has that role, content info. Come back over here, and now we should have that div element. And we can also test it differently. So we can say that we expect that this div element has the text that we want. So to do that, we just say to have text content, and you just give it the text you want. So in this case, its name is Jack. There we go. Let's take a look at our test, and we can see that we're passing again. But let's see it not pass. So we know we passed in Jack. Let's pass in foo instead, and see that in this case, it doesn't pass. And we can even get some interesting information here. It says name is foo when it's looking for name is Jack. Okay, cool. So let's fix this again, and we can even test attributes. So we can also add more expectations on ourselves and say that our div element is going to have an attribute. And then you just give it the attribute that you're looking at. So in this case, that'd be that role. And we expect that that role is, well, let's start off with nothing. See it fail. Yep. There we go. We expected that it was going to have nothing, and it has content info. So let's change that to content info. And there you go, we pass. Cool. Okay, so what happens if you've got a component that has multiple elements in it that you want to test? So to try that out, I'm going to create a new component called sidebar. It'd be a navigation component where you give it a bunch of items, including the name and the href, and it goes and renders them out. And we then need to go and test that to make sure it does the right thing. So I'm going to go create a sidebar.tsx file. And I'll bring in person just to get a good starting point on that. And call this sidebar. And it's going to have items. And that items is going to be an array of objects where you've got a name, which is a string, and then a href, which is also a string. And we're going to have an array of those. Okay, so we don't need that content info there. And we're just going to go iterate through those items. And that's going to give us an item. And then with each one of those, we're going to have a div. And within that, the anchor tag with the name looks good. And we'll use that href as the key. Probably should be unique, right? And we'll just put on there role equals navigation, which is good. It's good from an accessibility standpoint. So let's go test this. I'm going to go copy our test from over here and create a new sidebar.test.tsx file. And we'll bring in sidebar. And now we want to render it with some items. So we have our items. That's going to be a value, which is an array. And then within that, we'll have name, test, sure, path is test, which is not path, it's href. And I actually want this to be its own array. So I'm going to cut this out of here and make it items. And then create a new constant for items, which has that array in it. So how are we going to get all of the potential items? Well, there's get all variants for these. So for example, get all by role. And in this case, it's navigation. And we'd have anchor elements, which is going to be an array of anchor elements. And we can say that the 0th one should have test, or at least items 0.name, right? And then its href should be items 0.href. But let's just set it to blank just to make sure that's actually getting tested. And set that to the 0th item. All right, let's see. How are we doing? Okay, so it fails where we expect it to. The href is not blank. Let's go and put in there items 0.href. And we're passing. Very cool. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is how to test for event callbacks, like an on-click. I'm going to close up a bunch of these files, and we'll create our own version of a button wrapper. So I'm going to create a new file called button wrapper.tsx. And let's go get ourselves a nice starting point again. Pop that in there. And this is going to be a button wrapper. And we're going to use that React.function component declaration in TypeScript. So because we're wrapping button, we want to pass through all of the props of the original button. So you need to use React detailed HTML props. So let's do that. And we need to tell which attributes we want. So in this case, that's the attributes of the button element. And then you also need to specify button element. And now we've got all of the props. And we can just pass those on to our button. Now let's say we also want to add a title. So we can say have a title, which is a string. We could use children for this, but we want a title. So we'll add title here and pull that out. And then this is going to be title like that. So let's go test this out. So I'm going to go back over to a test file and grab that contents. And let's make a button wrapper.test.tsx file. So the test that we want to do here is to handle an on-click. So I'm going to put in here handles on-click, and I'm going to use the button wrapper, and we'll give it the title of, add item. So it's happy already, but we need to pass it an on-click handler. So I'm going to go pass it a stub function created by Jest. So we'll create onClick as jest.fn. And this is basically a function that is going to track how often it's called and what it's called with. So I'm going to pass that to onClick, and then I can go get that button by its, well, let's just do by text, and give it the text of add item. And that's going to give us a button element. So now we got to actually go click that button in order to see that onClick gets called back. So to do that, I need to bring in fire event. And I can do fire event.click and give it the button element. And that's actually going to simulate a click on that button. And now how do I know that it's been clicked? Well, I need to go and expect on that onClick and say that it's been called, well, in this case, one time. That's certainly good enough. So let's hit save. And actually, let's just change that to 0 to watch it fail first. And now it fails because we expected that it was called 0 times, and it actually got called once, which is exactly right. So we'll change that to 1. And now it passes. Very cool. All right, so let's start looking at state and hooks by creating a counter example and testing it. So I'm going to close these up. So I'm going to create a counter.tsx file. And to accelerate this a little bit, I'm just going to paste in a good counter. This has a state value for the count. It's got a button where you can click on it and add 1 to that count every time. And then it's got a div that basically puts out how often that button's been clicked. Pretty easy stuff. So let's go back over here to our button wrapper test because it's got that fire event that we're going to want to use to simulate clicking on that button, and copy it and then create a new file called counter.test.tsx. Paste that in there, and we'll bring in counter. Now we don't have an onClick or anything like that, but we do know that the counter has a button on it that says add 1. So let's go get that, and that's going to give us our button. And then we need to go and get the element that's got the text. So let's go do that. Create a div element, which in this case we can get by role. And we know that that role was content info. And so we're going to look to see if that div element has that text of the count. And how is that formatted? Let's go back over here. Count is count. Makes sense. So let's do count is 0. We know that's not going to work because by clicking that, it should be 1. So let's see. All right, yeah. We expected it to say count is 0, and it turned out to be count is 1. So let's change that to 1. And now we can watch everything pass. Rockin'. And isn't it great to have that feedback right away? Because we've got this testing system that's actually watching the code as we test. It's a great virtuous cycle. If you really get into that, there's a system called Wallaby that actually will run these tests dynamically as you type. It's really cool stuff. Okay, so now let's get into some really interesting stuff with a use effect. So we'll have a component that makes an API call. So let's close this up. And again, I'm going to make a new component, call this API component. And just paste in this API component that I have. It's a React function component. It's got some data that it gets back with the structure of a name. There's a use effect that fetches from an API endpoint, gets the response back, converts it from JSON, and then if the component is mounted, it then sets that data. If you're not familiar with this, this is actually a really nice way to safeguard against this fetch coming in late and then setting data when the component is unmounted. So we start off saying that the component is mounted, and we check to make sure that the component is mounted before we do a set data. And then if the component is unmounted, meaning this function, this cleanup function is called, then we set is mounted to false, and that'll make sure that this set data isn't called. Now down here, we only show this data if we have it. So let's again use content info in there. And let's go make our test. So let me just pick off one of these tests, copy it, and then I'll make a new file, API component.test.tsx. Paste that in there, and we're going to see that it gets the data. So I'll have API component. And what we want to do is test one, that this data shows up and that this div is created. So we kind of actually need to wait for things. So this is going to be an asynchronous test. And then how do we actually have an API? Well, we don't have an API. So we need to use a mock service for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this library called the mock service worker. This is actually an excellent library, and it's pretty much state of the art. So the way that we do this is we basically set up a worker that will respond to this API. So to do that, I'm going to go import from service worker rest and setup server. And then I'm going to use that setup server to create that API endpoint. I'm going to say that this is a get endpoint, and I'm going to return name is Jack. So we don't want that server running all the time. We want some lifecycle functions. So these functions are before all, meaning before all the tests, and then after all the tests. In this which case, we're going to use server.listen to fire up that server, and then server.close when all the tests are done. And then after each test, we are going to reset the handlers. Of course, there's only one test here, so no big deal with that. Now we've rendered the component, but we need to wait for that API call to complete. So to do that, we're going to bring in wait for from the testing library. And then we're going to use an await on wait for to get that element with the role that we want. So in this case, that's that content info element. And that's going to give us our output element. And then we can go run some assertions on that output element. We can say that, in this case, out should have that text content that we want. So let's see, text content, and what are we looking for? Well, we'll just start off with an empty string and see what it comes up with. We don't need that. Cool. Okay, so we expected nothing, but we got name is Jack. That's awesome. That actually did the entire round trip. It used the use effect, it made the fetch call, it got the data back. Really great stuff. So let's put that in there. And now we've got some running tests. Very cool. Okay, so why stop at components? Let's go and take a look at how to actually test custom hooks. Because I think when you're doing React, knowing how to do custom hooks is a really important skill. So we're going to go create a very simple use counter hook. And it's just going to have a basic counter in it. So we've got a use state, we've got a use callback, and it's going to return the count, and then an increment callback where you can increment that count. Pretty simple stuff. So how do we test that? Well, we're going to use a different testing library for that. So let me go make another file called usecounter.test.ts. And we're going to bring in our counter from that use counter file. But we're also going to bring in some functions from a testing library specifically designed for React hooks. In this case, testing library, React hooks. And that's going to have a render hook, which is going to render the hook. And then there's also an act function, which allows you to basically say, okay, now do the increment, for example, in this case. So let's set up our test and say that it should increment. Create a function. And then we're going to first call use counter by using that render hook. Let's try this out. Result is, yeah, okay, here you go, GitHub Copilot. Thank you so much for that. So we want to render that hook, and we want to start off with a use counter. Now that result has like the count and the increment in it, which was the result of that hook. And now we want to go and act on it. So we want to call act. And then within that, we say result.current. That's going to give us the current result. We're going to increment that. And then we can expect that the result.current.count to be, well, let's start off with 0 and see it fail, and then change to 1. Yep, there we go. We expected 0, we got 1. And now let's change that over to 1. And now everything passes. So how do we do an asynchronous hook? Glad you asked. Let's create a new hook called use API that is basically the same thing that our API version did. So this is going to do that same API call. In fact, this is just a copy and paste from that component, and it's just going to return back the data. So let's go and make a test for this. Use api.test.ts, and we are going to bring in a bunch of this testing stuff from here, as well as from that test component for the API. So we need to set up that server. And bring in the REST and setup server imports. All right, starting to look good. Okay, so now let's bring in use API. And we want to use API. But we're not actually going to do anything with this. So we don't need that. But the data is now just the current result. And we want that to be name Jack. Yeah, but we actually have to wait for it. So how are we going to do that? So the way that we do that is we actually get another element off this called wait for next update. And we can use an async function here and then just await, wait for next update. And let's just make that empty and see that it fails. Yep, it got back name is Jack. And we had name is nothing, so let's change it to name is Jack. And there we go. And now what we need to do is instead of saying to be, we want to say to equal. There's a slight variation between these. One is an identity check and the other is an equality check. So in this case, let's see, does to equal work? Yeah, perfect, awesome. So you need to know the difference between when you're checking if the two objects are actually the same object versus the two objects have the same value. Okay, so we've looked at React components, asynchronous React components, hooks, and asynchronous hooks. Next thing to look at are ones where you have a state manager involved. And the most popular state manager, to some degree, I would say, is Redux. So I've already installed Redux. So let me go create a store, and we can test out how to test a component that uses a Redux store. Let me close out a bunch of these files. And I'm going to create a new file called store.ts. And I'm going to bring in the Redux store that you get if you go through the Redux toolkit walkthrough. So it goes and creates a counter store that has increment and decrement. I'll show you what it looks like here. We got the counter state that's got a value. That value starts at 0. We've got a slice called counter, which has the initial state. It's got increment, decrement, increment by amount, fun stuff. And then we can get a store that we get from create store. And then we got the root state type and the dispatch. We also have the increment and decrement and all that great stuff. So a pretty standard Redux toolkit store. So let's go create a component that's actually going to use that store. So I'm going to create a new file called Redux counter. Paste that in there. And that is going to use selector and dispatch from React Redux. And it's going to bring in increment and decrement. It's going to use a selector to get the current count. And then it's going to have dispatch with it and uses to dispatch increment and decrement actions. And then there's going to be a span in there that has the current count. So how do we go and test this one? So let's go and create a Redux counter.test.tsx. Okay, so let's bring in some imports. I'm going to bring in React and then render a screen and fire event just like we did before, and then that Redux counter. So let's test increment. And we're going to want to render that Redux counter. And then we're going to want to go get that content info and expect that it will have 0 in there for the current count. And then I'm going to grab that increment button and I'm going to click on it. And then we're going to expect that counter to have a text count of 1. So let's see what happens. All right, so let's go back up to the top here and see what the issue is. So we can see that we didn't actually put a provider on this. So like every Redux component, it needs to have a provider somewhere to provide the store down. So let's go and bring in that provider. And then let's wrap that Redux counter in it. But we also need a store, right? So what are we going to put in there for the store? So in this case, we're going to bring in the store from the store. Pop that in there. And now we pass. Awesome, cool. But it's a little more twisty, right? Because Redux is global, which means that now the store is actually globally set to 1. So what are we going to do if we want to try this again? Essentially, we'll say copy and paste the exact same test, and so say increment again. Let's see what happens. Well, now we blow up because we expected at this point in the test, let's go back down here, we expect that the counter is going to have a count of 0 at this point, but it actually has a count of 1 because in the previous test, we actually incremented that value. So in this case, I've exported create store from the store as well, and that's the one that actually creates a store. So I'm just going to call create store right here and create store down here, and that's actually going to generate a new store for each test. So take a look. And now we pass. And that's something you really need to pay attention to when you're doing these tests, is to make sure that your environment is clean on every single run. Okay, so now we've taken a look at Redux. Let's take a look at Zustand, which is a popular replacement for Redux. And I'm just going to jump over here and take a look at the Zustand homepage because dang if it isn't the coolest page ever. And we're basically going to use this Zustand store as our test. Basically exactly the same thing, really, honestly. It's just an incrementer store. So we'll start off with a new Zustand store file. And I'm going to paste in the Zustand store. And that's going to give us back a custom hook called useStore, which we're going to use in our component. So I'm going to create a new component called Zustand counter. And what it does is it brings in useStore from Zustand store. And then all you got to do is just get count and increment. Pretty easy. And then we got an increment button and we got the count. You can see why people actually really like this. It's a lot less boilerplate than even Redux Toolkit, which is a lot less boilerplate than Redux. All right, so how do we test our Zustand counter? Okay, so I'm going to bring in render screen and fire event and also Zustand counter. And then I'm going to create a test for add 1. And again, we will render that Zustand counter. And we're going to go get that content info element and expect it to have a text content of 0 because we're starting off at 0. Then we're going to grab that add button and click on it. And then we're going to expect that that counter would have 1. All right, let's try it out. And it works great. But again, this is global. So what happens if I do this again? Add 1 again. So we run into the same issue. It expects that it's going to start off at 0, but it actually is 1. But there's actually a really easy fix for this. I'm going to bring in the store from that Zustand store. I'm so impressed with the fact that I'm actually getting the pronunciation right. I hope I am. And with that, I'm going to get the original state of that store. So I'm going to say that's original state. And then from there, I'm going to do get state. And that's going to give me the original state. And then before each test, I'm going to set the state back to the original state. Let's try it out. And there we go. Works a treat. All right, well, as usual, all of this code is available to you on GitHub for free. And I would love to hear from you in the comments about how you do your React testing and anything that I might have missed and you'd like to see in another viewer-suggested video. In the meantime, of course, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you really liked it, hit the subscribe button and ring that bell, and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out. That was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. A lot more to go through, but I hope it works for you.